Seattle, Washington, June 3rd, 2021. Lisa Anderson, 48, a sophisticated and successful woman, lived in one of Seattle's most prestigious neighborhoods. Married for 22 years to Peter Anderson, a renowned real estate businessman, she had everything money could buy: a mansion overlooking the sea, luxurious cars, and a life surrounded by parties and social events. In the eyes of society, they were the perfect couple. But behind this facade of success and glamour, there was a very different reality. Lisa felt invisible, trapped in a marriage that had slowly become cold and distant. The glow of passion had faded, and she found herself increasingly suffocated by an emotionless life. It was then that she met Derek Collins. Derek was 25 years old, a bartender at a sophisticated club downtown. He was the type of man who attracted attention wherever he went. Tall, athletic, with an easy smile and penetrating eyes. That spring night, Lisa was at the club with some friends, in yet another attempt to escape the monotony that her life had become. And it was there, between one glass of wine and another, that Lisa and Derek's eyes met for the first time. Lisa felt something she hadn't felt in years: butterflies in her stomach. There was something about Derek's confidence, the way he looked at her, that made her feel young again. When he approached her to ask if she wanted another drink, the conversation flowed surprisingly well. Derek, in turn, noticed Lisa's elegance, but he also noticed something else: a lack hidden behind the powerful woman's pose. The weeks that followed were marked by furtive meetings. At first, it was just an exchange of glances and shy smiles when she passed by the club. But soon, the flirting evolved into something more. They began to meet outside the club, in discreet hotels, away from the eyes of society and, of course, Lisa's husband. Derek knew Lisa was married, but the age difference and her financial situation didn't bother him. He saw in Lisa a way to live more comfortably. Lisa, on the other hand, saw Derek as an escape from the boring life she led with Peter. She liked how he made her feel alive and wanted and special. And over the months, this forbidden relationship began to consume Lisa. She started spending money without thinking. He bought Derek expensive gifts, luxury watches, designer clothes, and even paid for trips. Derek seemed to enjoy the attention and cuddles, but he didn't have the same emotional attachment as Lisa. For him, it was a convenient relationship, a game in which he knew he had control. But for Lisa, it became more and more of an obsession. She wanted more. He was no longer content with sporadic meetings and exchanging messages. She wanted Derek all to herself. She started sending messages during the early hours of the morning, calling repeatedly when he didn't respond, demanding explanations about where he was and who he was with. Derek, in turn, began to walk away. He felt that Lisa was crossing a dangerous line. What was once fun and exciting was turning into a burden. As time passed, Lisa became more and more desperate. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Derek. He began threatening to tell Derek's wife, or even his husband, everything if he tried to walk away. The obsession consumed her, took away her sleep, and made her paranoid. She became increasingly unstable, emotionally dependent on Derek's attention, even though she knew she was on a path of no return. What once seemed like just a passing fling began to take over every aspect of Lisa's life. She began to neglect her husband, her friends, even the social events she used to attend. Her life revolved around Derek. Every time he walked away, she felt an emptiness that was only filled when she saw him again. This emotional dependence led her to do things she never thought she would do. She started showing up at Derek's work without warning, following in his footsteps, trying to control his personal life. Lisa was in a spiral of self-destruction, and as she sank into this obsession, little did she know that her life was about to fall apart in a brutal way. Because, on the other side, Peter was starting to notice the changes. He was no longer the naive man who blindly believed in the perfect marriage. Small details began to catch his attention. The way Lisa hid her cell phone, their frequent departures, the growing distance between the two. Lisa's secret was about to be revealed, and the consequences would be devastating. That summer of 2021, in Seattle, a simple obsession would turn into a deadly game. where love, jealousy, and betrayal would lead to a tragic and bloody outcome. Summer was in full swing in Seattle. Long sunny afternoons brought a sense of calm to most people. But for Peter Anderson, those hot days only intensified the coldness growing within him. Something was wrong. He could no longer ignore his wife Lisa's strange behavior. Peter has always trusted Lisa. During the 22 years of marriage, there were never any major problems. Of course, like any long-term relationship, the romance faded over time, but he believed they had a solid partnership. They understood each other, shared dreams, and built a life together. But in recent months, Lisa has changed. She was more distant, and excuses for unexpected and mysterious departures became more and more frequent. Peter noticed the tension in the air. She constantly had her cell phone in her hand, which was not like her. As he approached, she quickly turned off the screen, hiding it as if it were a secret. She also spent long periods away from home without a plausible explanation. At first, Peter thought she was just distracting herself with something temporary, perhaps a hobby or a new friendship. But something in his demeanor said it was much more than that. One day, while Lisa was in the shower, Peter took her phone. His heart was beating fast because he knew what he was about to do could change everything. He had never suspected Lisa before, but now something consumed him. Upon unlocking the phone, Peter was shocked to see a strange amount of messages exchanged with a contact called D. There were photos, heart emojis, and messages he would never have imagined seeing. The messages were full of intimacy. There was no doubt. Lisa was having an affair, and the man she was involved with was much younger. The name was Derek. Peter read in shock as he watched Lisa's impassioned declarations and Derek's casual responses. It was clear that Lisa was completely engaged, while Derek seemed distant, almost cold in comparison. Derek took advantage of the situation. He liked the expensive gifts Lisa gave him, but he clearly didn't have the same deep feelings. Peter's anger began to turn into something darker. He felt his skin burn. His heart beat violently in his chest. He read and reread those messages. Each word cut deeper than the last. How could she? How dare she destroy everything they had built over the years? But Peter was not a man of impulsive confrontations. He was calculating, meticulous, and decided that, before acting, he would need more proof. These messages were not enough. He needed something he could use to completely turn the tide. Over the next few weeks, Peter acted with a disturbing calm. He continued his routine as normal, giving no indication that he knew what was happening. But inside, he was seething. He started following Lisa in secret. He watched her meet Derek several times in discreet hotels on the outskirts of the city, always off the radar of her acquaintances. Peter took photos, recorded every time, every location. He wanted to put together a complete dossier before acting. Every encounter he witnessed was like a dagger in his chest. The sight of his wife, laughing and touching Derek, destroyed him inside. Peter knew he was one step away from losing control. And as he watched it all, a deep anger began to transform into something much more dangerous, a thirst for revenge. One of these nights of vigil, Peter decided that he could no longer just watch. He needed to face this head on. I needed to do something to regain control. But the idea of just exposing the betrayal didn't seem enough. He wanted Derek to pay for what he had done, and I wanted Lisa to feel the weight of her choices. So, one Sunday night, when Lisa left the house claiming she was going to meet a friend, Peter followed her again. He saw her enter a cheap hotel, the same one she had been using for the past few weeks. This time, Peter didn't stay outside. With his stomach churning and his hands shaking with anger, he entered the lobby and got the information on the room where she was staying. He climbed the stairs slowly, feeling each step echo in his mind. When he reached the door, he heard muffled laughter inside. His heart raced. Peter wasn't ready for the confrontation, but the shock of reality paralyzed him. For a moment, he considered going in and ending it there, but then something crueler appeared in his mind. He didn't just want to confront Lisa. He wanted her and Derek to pay back in a way they would never forget. I wanted the price to be much higher than either of them could have imagined. Peter moved away from the door and left the hotel without being noticed. He knew what he had to do. I knew Derek would be the target. After all, He was the intruder in her life, the reason everything was falling apart. But most of all, Peter wanted it to be done in such a way that no one would ever suspect him. At that moment, the plan began to form in his mind. Peter was ready to take matters into his own hands and turn that case of betrayal into something much darker and more definitive. He knew that when the time came, Derek wouldn't stand a chance. Peter's discovery was just the beginning of a series of events that would transform their lives forever. What started as a simple case of infidelity was about to become a deadly hunt, where revenge would be the only thing that mattered. And at that moment, Peter decided there would be no mercy. Peter was no longer the man his wife knew. He had changed. Internally, he transformed into someone cold, methodical, and dangerous. Anger had shaped him in ways he never thought possible. Lisa's betrayal would not be forgiven, but her punishment would come in time. The immediate target of his fury was Derek Collins. Peter has spent the last few weeks planning every detail. He researched Derek's habits, where he lived, where he worked, and who his friends were. He knew his routine almost as well as he did. He knew when Derek left to work at the bar and when he returned to his small apartment downtown. Everything was meticulously mapped out in his mind. Peter wanted the blow to be surgical, leaving no traces. On the night of July 5th, 2021, Peter was ready to act. He waited until Lisa went to sleep and left the house quietly. His hands were shaking slightly, but his mind was focused. He had prepared everything. The gun he had purchased on the Seattle black market was hidden in the glove compartment of his car. He also had gloves and a black mask, which would help him avoid any identification. He drove calmly to Derek's apartment. I knew he would be there, as I had followed in his footsteps that afternoon. Derek had left work at the bar around 11 p.m. and headed straight home. I was alone. Peter knew that Lisa wouldn't find him that night, which made his plans even easier. Upon arriving at Derek's building, Peter parked the car a few blocks away, in a poorly lit area. I didn't want to be seen or recognized. With firm but calculated steps, he walked towards the building. It was an ordinary apartment building, nothing fancy. Peter watched the lights from the windows, trying to visualize which one was Derek's. He had studied the floors and knew exactly where he lived. Upon reaching the building's door, Peter forced entry with a piece of wire, unlocking the lock in seconds. The training he had done months before for occasions like this was now proving useful. He climbed the stairs silently, feeling his heart beating in his chest. Each step seemed to increase the tension, but Peter knew there was no room for hesitation. This was personal, and he was determined to end it once and for all. He arrived at the door of Derek's apartment. The silence of the hallway enveloped him, and he took a deep breath before putting on his gloves and mask. I knew I needed to be quick and precise. Peter used the master key he had obtained, the fruit of his careful efforts, to unlock the door. With a soft click, he entered. Inside the apartment, everything was dark, except for the dim light coming from the television turned on in the living room. Derek was lying on the couch, asleep, a half-empty can of beer on the coffee table. The low sound of the TV covered the sound of the door opening, and Peter moved silently, like a predator on the prowl. He watched Derek for a few seconds. Here was the man who had destroyed her marriage. The man who took his wife, his peace, and his dignity. And now, Derek would pay for it. Peter's anger turned into something cold and calculated. He took the gun out of his coat, clutching it tightly, and approached the couch. The sound of metal being cocked woke Derek up. He opened his eyes in confusion, taking a few seconds to realize what was happening. When he finally saw Peter standing before him, with the gun pointed at his face, his body froze in terror. "Who are you?" Derek managed to stammer out, his voice shaking with fear. Peter didn't respond right away. He just stood there, watching the panic growing in Derek's eyes. It was a moment of pure satisfaction for Peter, seeing the man he despised so much silently plead for his life. But Peter wasn't there to talk. "You destroyed everything," Peter muttered, his voice low and full of hate. "Everything I built with my wife, you took from me. I didn't know. Derek started to stutter, but Peter interrupted him. "Don't lie to me," Peter whispered, his voice full of contempt. "I know exactly what you did. You used her, manipulated her, and destroyed my family." Derek raised his hands, trying to move away, He was panicking. His heart was beating wildly as he tried to look for a way to escape. But there was no way out. Peter was determined. With one swift movement, Peter pulled Derek off the couch and threw him against the wall. The noise echoed throughout the apartment, but no one in the building seemed to hear it. Derek tried to fight, but Peter was bigger and stronger. He pressed the gun against Derek's chest, his eyes boiling with anger. "You don't deserve the chance to explain yourself," Peter whispered, each word filled with cold fury. "You destroyed the only thing that mattered to me." And with a firm movement, Peter pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed throughout the apartment. Derek stumbled back, his hand instinctively going to the wound in his chest. He looked at Peter with wide eyes of disbelief before falling to the ground. Blood began to quickly spread across the floor, forming a pool around the body. Peter stood there, watching as the life drained from Derek's eyes. The apartment was silent again, except for the sound of the television still playing in the background. There was no more screaming or pleading. Everything was over. With his breathing controlled, Peter put the gun away and quickly checked the apartment. He couldn't leave a trace. He took off his gloves and mask, making sure to clean off any evidence that could link him to the crime. Every movement was calculated, meticulous. He knew he needed to act quickly, but without rushing. When he was done, Peter looked at Derek's body one last time. The feeling of sated revenge consumed him, but it also brought a dark emptiness. Nothing would change what happened. Lisa had still betrayed him, and Derek was dead. But somehow it seemed necessary, almost inevitable. Peter left the apartment through the same door he entered, disappearing into the dark Seattle night. No one had seen anything, no one suspected anything. And that night, Lisa's obsession and Peter's thirst for revenge resulted in a silent tragedy. But what Peter didn't yet know was that the consequences of this brutal act were just beginning to unfold. The deadly game was far from over, and Derek's death was just the first move in a series of unpredictable and dangerous outcomes. The morning after the murder, Peter woke up feeling... The day started with a feeling of normality, but Peter felt increasing tension as he prepared to go to work. Lisa, as always, was distracted, more focused on her cell phone than anything else. Peter knew that Lisa hadn't yet discovered Derek's death, and he was determined to keep up appearances until the time was right to confront her. But his mind was away from work. Every phone call he received, every email, seemed like a potential threat, a sign that his secret could be revealed. While Peter tried to maintain a normal facade, news of Derek's murder began to spread. The body was found on the morning of July 6th by a concerned neighbor who heard a strange noise coming from the apartment. When police arrived, the apartment was a crime scene that clearly indicated a violent confrontation. The blood, the marks on the wall, and Derek's body were a shocking combination for investigators. They immediately began a search for clues, but so far, nothing that led them to Peter. With the case being investigated by the police, the city of Seattle began to speculate about the identity of the killer. Local media covered the story heavily, spilling details about Derek's life and the brutality of the crime. For Peter, each report was a constant reminder of his deed. The fear of being discovered became a constant shadow, looming over him every moment. Lisa finally learned of Derek's death through the news. She was in shock when she saw the report on television. Her expression of astonishment and despair was evident. Peter watched the scene from afar, trying not to reveal his own inner turmoil. Lisa was left in tears, her face covered in shock and confusion. She contacted the police, stating that Derek was just an acquaintance, a friend who had drifted away, but the desperation in her tone didn't go unnoticed. Lisa's behavior was a mix of genuine shock and calculated desperation. She began frequenting the news, providing emotional interviews, and eventually finding ways to link Derek to past events that could explain the violence. It was as if she was trying to create a scenario where Derek's death was more of an inevitable tragedy than a consequence of his actions. As the investigation progressed, police began to put the pieces together. Derek's death sparked a series of questions about his life and connections. The police examined his messages, contacts, and any clues that could lead to the motive for the murder. They spoke to acquaintances, friends, and even people at the bar where Derek worked. With each new interview, the case seemed to become more intricate and mysterious. Peter kept in touch with a private detective he had hired to monitor the progress of the investigation. The detective, who was working discreetly, had no clues that would lead him directly to Peter, but the climate of fear was growing. The pressure was mounting, and the possibility of a connection with Peter seemed more real with each passing day. Meanwhile, Lisa was wallowing in her own form of despair. She began attending support groups for people who had lost loved ones violently. His behavior seemed more nervous and disoriented. The nights were especially difficult for her, and she began to manifest symptoms of severe stress. Peter watched from afar, trying to notice any sign that Lisa was about to discover the truth. However, Lisa was increasingly distant, consumed by her own guilt and panic. What Peter didn't know was that, even without direct evidence linking him to the crime, Lisa's behavior was starting to raise suspicions. The way she reacted to the news of Derek's death, her constant involvement in the news, and her relationship with Derek were becoming topics of interest to investigators. Lisa was under scrutiny, and her acting began to look more suspicious. That night, as Peter was trying to relax after a stressful day, his phone rang. It was a message from the private detective with a disturbing update. The message stated that Lisa had been called in for a new interrogation session with the police. The evidence was starting to connect, and investigators were getting closer to the truth. Peter froze. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. He knew that the police were beginning to uncover the connection between Lisa and Derek, and that the risk of being discovered was increasing. Peter's mind was racing a mile a minute. He needed to act quickly before it was too late. The next morning, Peter made a drastic decision. He needed to make sure Lisa wasn't an obstacle to him, and more importantly, he needed to protect his own secret. He began planning a way to eliminate any possible connection between him and the crime. Peter found himself in a maze of lies and strategies, where any mistake could lead to his arrest. With the investigation moving forward and Lisa becoming a central figure, the consequences of her actions were unfolding in unpredictable ways. Peter realized that he was trapped in a web of deceit and secrets, and that the only way to escape was to act quickly and precisely. The price of revenge was becoming higher every day, and Peter was beginning to understand the true cost of his choices.